Good morning, ladies, wise women. I'm so happy to see you here today. First, I'd like to just briefly say thanks to everyone who's renewed their dues. We have at least 112 renewals so far. So take a moment, please look back at your newsletter for those who haven't sent their dues in. The form is right there, or feel free to fill it out and tell me to come get the check, whatever you'd like to do. But I encourage you to continue to do so, and thanks to everyone who has already renewed. The other thing to mention about January is that we're doing the three buildings at 597, and all the wise women are doing another food request for Mercy Learning, who are desperately in need. If you go to mercylearningcenter.org under wish list, you're going to see things, not just food, that I really frankly had never thought of. I have too many extra umbrellas. They could use extra umbrellas. And so these 3 pages here will tell you all of those sorts of things. For instance, like a paperback dictionary for the girls they're teaching English to. Maybe we can get a better price if we buy more. So please do pay attention to that. Come to 597 with your groceries. Call me, I'll come to you to get them. But if you look on mercylearningcenter.org, you'll get a kick out of it, and they all look so happy. Jane Farrar is doing a great job. And now I'd like to turn it over to Margaret so that she can tell you all about Sacred Heart's Kelly Mourinho, who's our speaker today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first presentation for 2021. We all know 2020 was a rough year, and so we know that 2021 has to be better. We're so pleased to start off the year by having Dr. Kelly Mourinho with us. As Barb said, Dr. Mourinho was on the faculty of Sacred Heart University, where she's coordinator of women's studies and also a lecturer there. She's an historian who specializes in American history for the 20th century and in particular focuses on women's history. So we all know that the suffrage movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment was an important part of that. In fact, most of you, I'm sure, remember that it's only been, well, less than a year, right, since the centennial for women's suffrage and the recognition of the 19th Amendment having been passed in August of 1920. So we're just over 100 years that that's been in effect. Dr. Marino has studied that whole issue, and not only just the suffrage movement, but what happened afterwards and how it affected other types of suffrage. So we're looking forward to her presentation today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marino, and as we've done in other cases, if you have questions, there'll be an email address at the bottom of the screen. You can send in emails that way. So again, welcome, Dr. Marino. So happy you're here with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present to your organization. It's very exciting to get to share some of this research on local history, which I'm really passionate about. I've been researching Connecticut suffrage for a very, very long time. And so I was wondering if, Bruce, you can share the PowerPoint for me, and if you can click to the second slide. And my presentation today just kind of gives like an overview of the suffrage story, again, focusing in on Connecticut and some of the developments in our own state, and just kind of concluding with some final thoughts about where we are currently politically in the country. And so do you want to click to the next slide? Perfect, thank you so much. So overall, the current work that's being done on women's suffrage is about diversifying the story. Much of the recent work has been on creating a more inclusive picture of the campaign that considers women of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Other initiatives recently have focused on giving attention to new grassroots stories, the stories of activists of different genders, sexualities, and ages. So this is what people have been up to in the past year. Connecticut's role in the movement has always been underplayed because it was a conservative state in the early 20th century, believe it or not, but yet it is still very significant given Connecticut's ratification of the 19th Amendment right after Tennessee, which helped to solidify women's right to vote as national law officially when people were challenging the legality of the decision in Tennessee. when it came down to just one vote in that state. The story of the beginning of the organized suffrage movement in Connecticut, and I say organized because throughout history, women had been promoting greater rights for a very long time, but there was no unified movement. The story of the unified movement starts in the period that actually followed the American Civil War. So during the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, women in the North and the South had taken up many duties to support the home front. So as one article commented, quote, Connecticut women were instrumental in the organizations of aid societies, the Connecticut Soldiers Relief Association, and in hospitals. Wartime social life in every Connecticut town revolved around the lives of soldiers, and women, children, and those unable to fight in the war rolled bandages, knitted mittens, packed food, and they made regimental flags. Wives of Connecticut soldiers even risked their lives to visit their husbands in camps during the winter. These activities often challenged them to leave the domestic sphere and take a greater role in public life. And after the war was over, many women felt that they had proven their dedication to the country and the good that they could do if they were allowed a greater public presence. So you can click, actually no, this is the perfect slide. I'm forgetting I had a title slide. By 1869, women inspired by work in the abolitionist movement that challenged slavery and African-American inequality banded together to create their own national suffrage organizations to push for women's rights in the United States for the first time. And so in this time period after the Civil War, there were two major mass women's suffrage organizations that were formed. This is in 1869, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. The American Women's Suffrage Association, the AWSA, was actually headed by Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Blackwell. Lucy Stone's picture is on the left-hand side of the PowerPoint slide. And the AWSA favored encouraging grassroots suffrage activism on a state level that would not detract from the campaign for African-American rights. Activists in AWSA, like Lucy Stone, argued that the period after the Civil War was the quote-unquote Negro hour. So it was the time for African-Americans to fight for greater rights, and women should wait. And so the other major mass women's suffrage movement that formed in 1869 was the NWSA, the National Women's Suffrage Association. And this one was headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are in the other image on the PowerPoint slide. And they took a much more controversial approach to activism. They wanted to push for a federal amendment to grant women the right to vote, and they didn't care about whether their campaign would detract from other social and political movements, particularly the campaign for African-American civil rights. Stanton in particular has been viewed in a controversial light in recent years because of the comments that she made that argued for women's suffrage using nativist and racist rhetoric that suggested that white women deserved the vote first over minority groups because they were more civilized or superior. And it was not until 1890 that these two organizations, the AWSA and the NWSA, merged, and they became known as the National American Women's Suffrage Association together. So their titles merged and their missions also merged. They wanted to campaign on the state and the federal level. So we commonly hear about the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the merged group, in most of the suffrage histories. The Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, which you can actually click to the next slide. The Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, having been established in 1869 in the state, was one of the earliest grassroots suffrage bodies likely to affiliate with the American Women's Suffrage Association, Lucy Stone's organization, and later the National American Women's Suffrage Association after the merger of the two groups. The reason the CWSA likely was a branch of the AWSA first is because of the popularity of the abolitionist cause in the state of Connecticut and in New England more broadly, and particularly among reformers active in the group. So there's no official word on this and studies that have been written about suffrage in the state, but I'm sort of guessing that CWSA was probably linked to the AWSA rather than the NWSA, just because there were so many abolitionists that were leaders in the CWSA early on. Little research has actually looked at the history of suffrage in Connecticut prior to 1910. That's still an area that's sort of wide open for research. According to scholar Carol Nichols, who has written the most extensive study of suffrage in Connecticut, but who also largely moves quickly through this early period, the early CWSA collected signatures for suffrage petitions. They rallied the government for suffrage and women's rights legislation in a state that would support the plight of working women and children, that would support temperance, married women's property rights, school suffrage, and more. Leaders in the early CWSA included Isabella Beecher Hooker, who is on the PowerPoint slide, of the famous Beecher family, all of whom were actively involved in social reform and some even nationally known. Her husband, John Hooker, also pictured on the slide, was also a noted activist, and other people in her family included, obviously Catherine Beecher, who was an educational activist for women's education, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And so she came from this prominent family of reformers. Isabella Beecher Hooker, huge leader in the early CWSA, alongside other people like Frances Ellen Burr, Olympia Brown, also noted activists, social and political reformers in the 1800s. Especially Olympia Brown worked in Bridgeport as a leader of actually a female leader. It was very controversial of a church for a period of time. Leaders in the early CWSA included, again, some of these figures that are pictured on the PowerPoint slide, and we know again that they were pushing for, again, school suffrage, married women's property rights, in addition to the larger passage of basically legislation that would give women the right to vote in presidential elections and things like that at the state and national level. Carol Nichols writes that this is a quote from her book, the early suffrage movement in Connecticut was hardly a movement at all, and that the CWSA was small at first in the 19th century, and that it did not attract energetic young leaders. Now, personally, I always felt like this interpretation didn't give a lot of the early generation of women's rights activists enough credit for the groundwork that they laid for future campaigners and for the next generation to take over. So I really do believe that's an area for some scholar to pursue for further research. Suffragists did face stringent opposition in Connecticut because the government in the state was in the hands, again, of a conservative majority that was not really open to change at this time. It wasn't the progressive state that it is today. And times were changing at the turn of the 20th century. So you can click to the next PowerPoint slide. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, westward expansion and industrialization were altering the American nation in many significant ways, and urban centers were experiencing astronomical growth. In 1860, only 16 cities had over 50,000 residents. By 1890, 1/3 of all Americans were living in cities. Immigrants and their children were a major source of urban population growth. And immigrants during the period in particular came from areas of Southern and Eastern Europe. As the population in cities like Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport expanded, so did the rates of disease, crime, pollution, low income, hazardous employment, and overcrowding in slum-like housing. Americans, Black and white, of the upper and middle classes took note, and they expressed concerns, rallying the government to pass legislation to deal with the issues that they saw in modern cities. And so you can click to the next slide. Many Connecticut women noted the poor living conditions that the lower classes faced in urban areas, including Katharine Houghton Hepburn, whose husband worked as a medical doctor in Hartford. So Katharine Hepburn, not the actress, but her mother, is going to be a huge suffrage leader, and she's on the left-hand side of her picture is on the left-hand side of the PowerPoint slide. Hepburn was particularly interested in sex hygiene and prostitution, fighting against prostitution, and what we consider today to be the spread of STDs. She, like other progressive reformers, believed that if women won the right to vote, they would have a greater influence in government to support legislation that would deal with the problems of the modernizing city and in social reform work. And Hepburn became involved in women's suffrage in 1909. That October, Emmeline Pankhurst, the British suffragette, known for her slogans, "Deeds, not words," visited Hartford for the first time to give a suffrage talk that Hepburn attended. There she met Emily Pearson, who's in the other picture in the PowerPoint slide. Pearson was a wealthy socialite from Cromwell whose family made it big in the floral industry. And she was well educated, she was civically engaged, she was a school teacher at the time who worked in Bristol. And they both became fast friends, together founding the Hartford Equal Franchise League to promote women's suffrage after the event. By 1910, a younger generation of suffrage leaders from Hartford and Greenwich, including Hepburn and Pearson, had come together and taken over leadership of the CWSA. Prominent activists included Caroline Rutz-Rees, Grace Gallatin Seton, and Dr. Valeria Hopkins Parker. These activists believed that winning women's suffrage, in the words of scholar Carol Nichols, could make a more just and humane society. And many of the new leaders were middle and upper class women with higher education. My own argument is that they used educational theatrics or tactics that were sensational, dramatic, and public to get attention for the vote, but also to teach the public about the cause by sending a particular message. The CWSA sent activists to give outdoor and indoor speeches at meetings of state Sunday school associations, local political parties, the Chamber of Commerce, labor unions, Jewish organizations, meetings of college and university professors, women's aid societies, gatherings of corset workers, and the events of many other organizations throughout Connecticut. One particular popular location that suffragists showed up to speak at was state fairs, where they set up booths, they arranged short addresses, they distributed literature, and they sold buttons. So on holidays like the 4th of July, suffragists would spread out in crowds, they would distribute literature, they would sell ice cream while handing out suffrage brochures. They stopped at outdoor parks, recreational places to give talks. So in the summer of 1914, for example, they pulled over at Ocean Beach Park in New London, and they used a rowboat as a speaking platform, taking to the sea to promote their cause for the beachgoers. Connecticut suffragists also took advantage of cheap and popular urban entertainment like plays and early forms of motion picture to campaign for their cause. In 1914, the assistant state organizer of the CWSA, Elise Gregory, caught media attention by organizing a performance of the play, How the Vote Was Won. And on another occasion in 1915, state suffragists showed a photo play called Your Girl and Mine at the Palace Theater in Hartford. These events drew large audiences, and they educated the public about suffrage for a very low cost. And so you can click to the next PowerPoint slide. Little information is known about the role of African-American women in the suffrage movement in Connecticut. The records show that CWSA activists campaigned among African-American women and that African-Americans organized for suffrage, but a lot of times we just have passing references in the CWSA meeting minutes. And so one of the difficulties is during the time period, there wasn't a historically Black newspaper published in the state until the 1930s. So trying to get at the story of some of these early activists has been a challenge this year for scholars. But we do know some things. One of the things that we know is that it comes from CWSA meeting minutes in 1918. The CWSA reported that a suffragist had spoken in New Haven to African-American women at a congregational church. 500 African-American women voted to organize a suffrage league in the city. CWSA activists spoke to African Americans in Stratford and Willimantic. In Willimantic, they spoke to the official boards of the Methodist, AME Zion, Baptist churches, but those are the only notes that we have about that particular work. The Connecticut Historical Society has also compiled an online exhibit with African American women who were socially and politically active in the early 20th century and possibly suffragists. In most cases, the women in the project registered to vote in 1920, or they were involved in the LWV's activism in the period that followed. They were likely suffragists. We don't have a lot of concrete material. We're still looking at some of these figures. I know a lot of the scholars working on the project are still researching, and I know other scholars throughout the state are still researching some of these figures. I did pull out a couple figures from the project to mention today in the presentation. So for example, Mary A. Johnson moved to Hartford in 1916. She was likely a suffragist. By 1918, she was the chairman of the Colored Republican Women of Connecticut and the vice president of the Connecticut State Federation of Colored Women. Belonging to these organizations would suggest an interest in politics and the suffrage cause. Wilton Historical Society identifies her as a suffragist in their online suffrage history project. So Mary A. Johnson. Another woman named Lena Knighton, also African-American woman, also moved to Hartford in 1918. A Hartford Current article from 1968 notes that she was a campaigner for women's right to vote. But again, we don't know a lot about the work that she did. We don't know if it was for suffrage. We don't know if it was in Connecticut or if it was in Georgia prior to moving to the state. But we do have that little clip from the newspaper about her work. And then Lin Lena Saunders is another woman, just sort of I picked a couple to highlight from their exhibit, who was a leader in New Haven of the NAACP. She was also likely a woman suffragist, as was Rose Payton, who registered to vote in school elections, an African-American woman, as soon as that right got expanded to women in Hartford. In terms of Mary Townsend Seymour, we do have records that show that she spoke out in advocacy of women's right to vote and was a member of many social and political organizations in Hartford, like the NAACP. Seymour corresponded with the CWSA, with CNWP leaders, including Carolyn Rutz Rees and Josephine Bennett. And she contributed to work to petition Alice Paul and the NWP to consider the rights of African Americans. So most people at this point in 2021, we know the most about Mary Townsend Seymour. And so she's the most frequently cited African American suffragist from Connecticut. So she was very socially and politically involved, and we have concrete evidence of her pre-1920 campaigning for the vote in the most detail compared to some of the more sketchy profiles of some of the other activists. Much more is known about the role of Black suffragists more generally in the movement in other locations. African American suffragists we know were marginalized from NAWSA and its affiliate organizations and not welcome in national suffrage organizations like the NWP. So they largely, because they were largely pushed out of national suffrage organizations headed by white women, and most white suffragists were willing to bridge class lines, but not racial lines, they had to create their own avenues through which to endorse women's right to vote. So they would support suffrage through the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and other Black women's clubs and organizations, including some all African American suffrage groups. So some of the most well-known nationally well-known African American suffragists included women like Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist, editor, and outspoken opponent of lynching from Mississippi, who played a role in mobilizing Black women for the vote. In 1913, in Chicago, Illinois, she helped to form the Alpha Suffrage Club, and the goal of that group was to recruit Black women to the equal franchise cause. And then Mary Church Terrell was a women's rights activist and civil rights activist from Tennessee, and she became another key leader in organizing African American women across the country for the vote. Terrell and her daughter were the only known Black women to take part in the NWP's White House picketing campaign. They did actually spend time on the picket line, Mary Church Terrell and her daughter. She was a key leader in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which endorsed women's suffrage on its platform. And through Terrell and Wells' urging, African American delegates, including members of Delta Sigma Theta sorority representing Howard University, marched in the March 1913 suffrage demonstration in Washington, D.C. Recent scholars have also found that many other women, Latino, Native American, Asian American, young and old, participated in the suffrage campaign, and that it was a mass reform movement in the 20th century. So you can actually click to the next PowerPoint slide. Bringing things back to the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, perhaps the most ambitious and well-publicized tactic that was actually adopted by Connecticut suffragists, inspired by activists from New York and England during the campaign, was the use of suffrage parades. CWSA state organizer Emily Pearson explained the importance of this type of suffrage event in a 1914 speech she gave, and she said, quote, "To feel the significance of a women's suffrage parade is hardly grasped by the casual observer. Only those who have together marched shoulder to shoulder for a great ideal can realize the spiritual uplift which comes at such a time. To feel yourself part of a great movement is to forever end any self-consciousness." And that's a quote from Emily about the value of a suffrage parade. So on May 3rd, 1914, state suffragists halted trolley traffic for over an hour, orchestrating one of the largest political demonstrations in Connecticut history. The Current called it spectacular, estimating that more women participated in the first organized suffrage parade of 1914 than any other prior procession at the Capitol. The newspaper described the scene in Hartford at the parade, noting how spectators lined the sidewalks, overflowed into the streets, leaving only a narrow line for marchers to pass. And it was beautiful and orderly. The suffrage parade furthered the imagery that was used by Connecticut suffragists throughout the campaign, demonstrating that women could participate in public and the political sphere without abandoning their femininity. A prominent motorist, Emily also promoted the use of automobiles in suffrage campaigning. Cars provided a new way to bring suffragists to the people of Connecticut, and interacting with citizens face-to-face helped to defeat negative stereotypes of suffragists as unladylike spinsters. Uncommon throughout rural Connecticut and often reserved as upper-class luxuries, automobiles caught people's attention on country roads. Pearson and her supporters adorned their cars with colorful ribbons and catchy names like Votes and the Radical, as they were referred to in the newspapers, and these suffrage auto tours were heavily covered by the media. Under Emily Pearson's leadership, state suffragists also took advantage of other creative exhibits and displays. And most significantly, Emily actually created a suffrage protest tactic called voiceless speech. And basically, this is where a suffragist would stand silently next to an easel and flip large cards with words or phrases for onlookers. And the tactic was designed to be used in show windows, like store windows, or on busy street corners where the loud noise of the automobiles and the crowds would make a traditional suffrage speech very difficult to hear. But the cards they would flip would get people's attention. Receiving national acclaim, Emily Pearson traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1913 to teach this tactic to aspiring advocates at a national suffrage school being held that year. Pearson was one of 85 suffrage leaders to participate as a teacher at the National Suffrage School. So you can click to the next PowerPoint slide. Although the event received little local press coverage, Emily Pearson's role as a suffrage school teacher in Washington, D.C. helped to build her national reputation and her relationship with prominent activists like Alice Paul, who's on the left-hand side of the PowerPoint, a suffragist from New Jersey, and Lucy Burns, a suffragist from New York. At this point, these two women were still members of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and Lucy Burns was actually in charge of organizing the suffrage school. Emily Pearson and other Connecticut suffragists who were displeased with their work with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, not thinking that it was doing enough for the cause, would work more closely with Alice Paul and Lucy Burns starting in 1917 as these women split away from the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association to form their own more radical suffrage group. By 1917, there were about 38,000 Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association members across the state, but the organization was facing constant opposition from conservatives, big business, the liquor industry in particular, which was worried that women would support policies that would hurt their economic situation. For example, they worried that voting women would promote prohibition, which was widely unpopular throughout Connecticut, and suffragists linked with the Prohibition campaign lost them a lot of potential allies throughout the state. By 1910, an anti-suffrage organization had even formed in Connecticut with like local branches, although little research has covered this anti-suffrage organization. The year 1917 marked a crucial year for the national movement and the Connecticut campaign. Tensions between NASA and Alice Paul's new, more radical organization, the National Women's Party, created conflict between state branches of both organizations, prompting many notable women again to switch sides. You can click to the next PowerPoint slide. In January of 1917, the National Women's Party sent suffrage picketers with controversial banners to the White House gates in Washington, D.C. to pressure President Woodrow Wilson and Congress to grant women the right to vote. The picketing continued as the U.S. entered World War I. And while some people had ignored the protesters at first, once America entered World War I, they started to become viewed as distracting and even un-American radicals. Many people felt that the women should be surrendering to war work and supporting the home front and not campaigning for women's right to vote. NASA refused to endorse the controversial tactics of the Women's Party in DC. You can click to the next slide. That year, in 1917, an Irish woman named Catherine Flanagan became the first woman from Connecticut among several to face arrest in the National Women's Party's protests. After refusing to pay a fine for obstructing traffic, Flanagan was sentenced to 30 days at the Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia, along with 5 other suffrage picketers. Lucy Burns, who visited the prisoners, complained about their treatment and their lack of proper food. At Occoquan in particular, suffragists were emotionally and physically abused. Connecticut activists urged the state government to help Flanagan. Flanagan was secretary of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association and in DC on a personal vacation supporting the work of the Women's Party. Both the CWSA and the Connecticut branch of the NWP initially supported her actions, and CWSA leaders affirmed that she had the right to use her personal vacation any way that she chose. Katharine Hepburn, CWSA president, and the chairman of the Connecticut branch of the CNWP, the Connecticut branch of the National Women's Party, Lillian Ashkoff, sent Connecticut Congressman Augustine Lonogram constant telegrams stating concern about Flanagan's treatment at the workhouse until he visited the location in person. However, he asserted publicly that he saw no causes for complaint. Shortly after, prison officials transferred Flanagan to the hospital ward where she spent 2 days. The Hartford Courant reported that she suffered from nervousness and a rundown condition due to poor nourishment. After serving 24 days of her sentence, Flanagan was released early for good behavior. Upon return to the state, she resigned from the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association to join the Connecticut branch of the National Woman's Party, which had formed in 1916. Her resignation marked a turning point in Pearson and her colleagues' suffrage activities, as Hepburn, Pearson, and a large group of suffragists who joined the organization in 1910 left with her. Echoing the feelings of her colleagues, Hepburn wrote in her official resignation on September 19, 1917, "I've reluctantly come to feel that the policy of the National American Women's Suffrage Association is futile, academic, and out of date." In the aftermath of the picketing, tensions between the two organizations continued to increase as more opinions of CWSA officers conflicted with NAWSA's political agenda. The CWSA participated in food conservation activities during World War I, Liberty loan drives, assisted with the influenza crisis, donated to the Red Cross, and much more. But they did not picket the White House for women's right to vote. As a branch of NAWSA, they supported the policies of the National Association, which advocated either state or federal campaigning for women's suffrage in traditional ways and war work to help the home front. Catherine Ludington of Old Lyme was elected as CWSA president to replace Katharine Hepburn. Most notably, the organization began a tradition of citizenship education work and political literacy programming that laid the work for the League of Women Voters in the years that followed during the war. Working with the CNWP, Hepburn, Pearson, and supporters in this more radical organization refocused efforts on passing the federal amendment rather than the state suffrage campaign. Unlike the nonpartisan Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, women involved in the CNWP actively allied with politicians and even more aggressively lobbied congressmen for the passing of the 19th Amendment. They distributed literature, they wrote letters, and they visited key state representatives to explain their position in bold ways. They continued to protest outside the White House and other strategic locations. 14 Connecticut pickets were imprisoned during the NWP's demonstrations in Washington, D.C. in the late 1910s. Scholar Carol Nichols has suggested that although CWSA and CNWP leaders made public statements about policy difference in practice behind the scenes, the organizations were often working together. Key former CWSA leaders might have resigned their elected executive positions in the state association, but they continued their memberships while working for the Women's Party, which is really interesting because there was much more animosity at the national level than there was at the state level. You can click to the next PowerPoint slide. After years of hard work and dedication by suffragists across the country, on June 4th, 1919, the federal government passed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and votes for women advocates needed 36 states to ratify the legislation for it to become official. By the spring of 1920, NAWSA and the NWP leaders hoped to secure Connecticut as the final state despite continued long-standing and obvious opposition. Connecticut's General Assembly, however, was not scheduled to meet until January 1921. Despite the demands of the NWP and the encouragement of the CWSA organizers, Marcus H. Holcomb, the acting state governor of Connecticut, refused to call a special session of the Connecticut government, the legislature, to ratify the 19th Amendment. During protest week or emergency week, NAWSA sent 47 suffragists to Connecticut to pressure the governor to change his mind. These women, along with members of the NWP, argued that by failing to call a special session of the Connecticut legislature to pass the 19th Amendment, he was depriving women across the entire country of their right to vote in the 1920 election. When Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the Equal Suffrage Amendment on August 18, 1920 by one vote, Holcomb finally acted and called the special session. Connecticut's decision remained crucial as politicians and anti-suffragists across the country challenged the legality of the vote in Tennessee. Connecticut officially granted women the right to vote on September 14, 1920, ratifying the 19th Amendment, becoming the 37th state. 1920 was an important milestone in the women's movement, but not the be-all and end-all to end sexism, and state and local laws also kept Black women and other minority women from voting in particular areas for many years following this event. And so you can click to the last PowerPoint slide, just some concluding thoughts. So after kind of reviewing the sketch of the state movement, I just had like a couple wrap-up things to say. During the suffrage campaign, Massachusetts suffrage leader and later leader of the League of Women Voters, Maud Wood Park, argued that to rally women to take a more active role in civic life, they needed to be made to feel the obligation of opportunity. that they needed to be encouraged to reflect on the rights and opportunities that women currently have, and to understand that this was not always how things had been. And that this might always that this might not always be how things remain unless everyone participates in our democracy and exercises their political voice. In the early 1900s, activists like Park taught the younger generations about the history of the women's movement and women's struggle for equality as a tool to inspire them to take action. Park had a great idea. By telling the stories of the activists within our state and nation, the limitations put on them, and just how hard they struggled for the rights that we have today at this crucial moment historically and politically, we can generate an appreciation among people of all backgrounds and motivate them to lawfully, hopefully, participate in civic life. And this participation is important, I think now more than ever, to protect the values, freedoms, and rights that we all are most passionate about. And so that's kind of where I'm going to conclude things, and then just open it up if anybody has any questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kelly. That was really wonderful. It gave us a real picture of the suffrage movement. We have a number of questions. The first one refers to all those various strategies you mentioned for gaining support. You know, the boat at Ocean Beach in London, I mean, the marches, all those kinds of things. Were there any strategies that were particularly effective, or any slogans, let's say, that really resonated with people to get attention?
I think that in around 1910, once the younger generation of activists took over, the reason that they were so successful is they literally brought the campaign to the streets in a way that it had not been brought, at least in Connecticut, had not been brought to the public in the streets before. Prior to this, there was a lot of, there were speeches given, right? There was a lot of petitioning, but they weren't going out in crowds and in these public locations and distributing the material and sort of reaching people. Even the suffrage auto tours, where they were going to rural areas, sometimes for the first time, and reaching like a different audience, I think were particularly valuable. So that strategy of bringing the campaign to the streets, to the public, to a diverse audience, to corset workers in Bridgeport, and to people who are working in factories in Hartford, I think that was really valuable. Getting outside, getting in public space with their campaign, particularly city space, and again, trying some of these new tactics.
Okay, now were those strategies, as you say, new, or were those ones that you would find for other political movements, or just for standard elections, you know, running local or national elections? Were people doing that same kind of thing, or were the suffragettes really, breaking new ground in these activities?
They were inspired, the campaigners in NASA were inspired by the organized labor movement, which was increasingly more public and aggressive during the time period, definitely by other social and political activists, and by women's activism in Europe and other countries, particularly the UK, which is getting more and more aggressive as well during this time period, and more confrontational in public.
Okay, and we have another question related to the success of the movement. In addition to what the suffragettes were doing, were there males who were particularly supportive, maybe, I don't know, political figures or organizations like unions or churches or somebody else who really helped to move the movement ahead?
Yeah, and almost every state had at least one men's league for women's suffrage, if not multiple, at the local level. So there were a lot of men who were supporters in the campaign. I think there were even, especially early on, men who were members of NASA, though they weren't in like leadership roles, and a lot of men were invited to speak at suffrage events, and so they were definitely active allies in the movement. In my own research on college activism, I have many examples of men who were marching in suffrage parades. For example, they were mocked a lot of times by the crowds, and there were definitely, it was like people were yelling like really emasculating statements at them, like calling them bearded ladies and stuff when they're walking down the street. But yeah, so men were definitely hugely involved in advocating for this cause as well. And, it definitely was a mass movement, especially by the 20th century.
Okay. Now, our next question refers to what happens after the amendment was passed, and in particular, the voting of women. I mean, I'm sure 100% of women didn't go out and register to vote, and certainly that number didn't go ahead to actually vote in elections. Do you have any idea of, roughly the percentage of eligible women who who might have registered and voted, and how does that compare to males? I mean, we know even today we don't have anywhere near 100% of people registering to vote or actually turning up to vote.
Well, that's a good question. I don't actually know what the statistics are, but I do know that there was a lot of people who were active in the League of Women Voters, like Maudwood Park, were disheartened by the number of women who actually registered. It was a lot lower than people expected. And I think women tended to vote just like men. I think a lot of the activists thought that they were going to vote in sort of a gendered way, to support particular causes that seemed like women's causes, but they didn't do that. They voted just like men. And I think that was kind of shocking, to people. They thought they would support like maternalist politics and things like that. And that didn't really happen in the way people thought that it would.
So would you say in terms of the overall elections and so on, that there wasn't really much effect in terms of changing voting patterns and so on?
It didn't change voting patterns, but it did change political culture. And I think that's the more significant point, is like all of these male spaces, all these male governmental spaces now had to open to women. And all of these jobs in government and civic life that wouldn't even be anything that would be considered something that a woman can do. Now all of a sudden women were being considered for these different positions. Even at college campuses, political science and government classes were starting to be opened after this period to women for the first time, because women were demanding entrance into those classes and were taking an interest in wanting to sign up. So there's a cultural impact on government and civic life that I think was more significant than the number of people who were registered or who were going out and actually voting.
Right. So there was no attempt like today, we hear, of course, excessive concern about the women's vote, the women's suburban vote, all this dissection of the population and the patterns. And of course, we have very accurate polling both before and after elections, which were not available then. But I guess it sounds as if that wasn't really an issue.
No, well, the activists wanted it. I mean, like Maudwood Park and some of the activists in the 20s, they were promoting this cause of maternalist politics, but I just think it didn't get quite as much steam, maybe as some of the campaigners were hoping during the time period.
Yeah. All right. Our next, we have a few questions related to the suffragettes themselves. They're predominantly, as you said before, white. There was this conflict certainly with Black women, but they were generally upper middle class, certainly more educated than the general population. Do you have any idea how other women in the population looked at the suffragettes, women who were, for instance, older than the suffragettes, or maybe nowhere near their level of education or class? How did they view the suffragettes? Did they see them as their spokespeople, or just see them as quite different?
Well, I think that the movement was pretty diverse in general. A lot of different people supported the cause, and the reasons that they supported it were sort of all different. I think that the older version, right, of looking at the story is to kind of just say, and a lot of these members that were in NASA tended to be women past childbearing years, women who were white, women who were upper and middle class. But there were a lot of women who were active in the movement who didn't fit that profile and supported, the campaign through their own organization, maybe like a labor organization that put it on their platform, or through a local political party that put it on their platform, or the African American women who were supporting it through the NAACP or the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. All the acronyms are twisting my tongue, but I think for them, the way that they looked, or their objective of getting the vote, was sort of for different reasons. Like they weren't, they wanted to improve working conditions, or they wanted it to help give, greater support for another social or political campaign. I think a lot of different groups had different motivations for supporting the cause, but everybody sort of agreed it was something important to achieve, regardless of what they were going to do with that vote afterwards.
Okay, our next questions refer to the other changes going on in America during the early part of the 20th century. You mentioned, for instance, the move from rural to urban, and the great immigration from Europe, the primarily political and economic refugees, the so-called tired, hungry, and poor, coming to the U.S. What effect do you think that context had on the movement?
I think that, in a way, it sort of maybe pushed it forward because it gave more of a rationale for change. You had a lot of people coming over who were from different countries, and they had different philosophies about gender, different ideas about civic engagement and citizenship. And I think especially in a lot of these urban areas, they became like these cosmopolitan centers for, for new ideology and for change to come out of, like places like New York City and Washington, D.C. And that's why you see so much active suffrage mobilization and so much leadership. A lot of the movement's most famous leaders come out of these different locations. And I think they're shaped by a lot of the changes that are going on all around them and the diversity of perspectives because of, the immigration and all these, these different blendings of cultures that are going on in these different locations. And also, people are seeing, as these urban centers are growing, a lot of, issues in industrial America. And they're hoping some of these reformers, especially upper and middle class, like progressive reformers, they're hoping the women's vote is going to be a tool to, again, help to deal with crime, prostitution, gambling, alcoholism, and some of these other forms of vice, to help to kind of eradicate.
Okay, our next question refers to some of those prominent leaders from the suffragette movement. Obviously they're no longer with us, but if they were alive today or somehow we could speak with them, what do you think people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton would say about what happened to women's votes after they fought so hard to get them?
I think that, if they were going to speak today, I think people would be actually kind of proud, because I think that there had been the electoral turnout was pretty high, I think, in this past election. And I think there's been a lot of an increased attention to women's political issues and sort of special interest issues. So I think they would actually be really excited to hear about something like the Women's March and some of these more recent initiatives to bring the focus back on improving areas where women are still facing inequality, like in the professional sphere, for example, in politics, still trying to break into that, we're moving towards breaking that glass ceiling in different ways, but there's still these limitations. There's still this inherent gender discrimination that exists. There's still jobs that women have never had, like being the actual president of the United States. And so I think they would be, interested in some of those different things that were going on and excited about some of the positive changes that have occurred.
Okay. Our next question refers to the individual states. I mean, as we know, there were states that passed women's suffrage before it was granted at the federal level. And as you said, in spite of what we believe today of Connecticut and being at the forefront of working for people's rights and so on, Connecticut was not. It was more, places like Wyoming and so on. Can you speak a bit about the different states and which ones were, at the beginning of this in terms of giving rights to their own state residents, and, any comments you might have as to why that was more likely to happen out in those rural states, like Wyoming?
Yeah, so a lot of the early states that passed suffrage legislation were in the West. And the reason, really early on, and the reason that women won voting rights in those locations before, areas like urbanized areas in the East or like Northeast is because gender ideology was so different out there. If you were out in a rural area, for example, the husband and wife, let's say if it was like a heterosexual couple, the husband and wife both had to leave the household to make things work. They couldn't subscribe to Victorian values about gender and this idea that the men's world was the public and the women's world was the private, because they wouldn't be able to maintain a household and survive. So women had to go out and, cut down trees with axes and, work outside, work in the farm, trade and sell things and run a household and make wages, in order to survive, and maybe bring home the meat in order to survive in a way that they didn't necessarily in all situations, especially if you were middle or upper class, in an urbanized East Coast, Northeastern area in particular. And so the gender ideology and the gender expectations were much more fluid in the American West earlier, and men and women were taking a more equal share in creating communities and households. They had to in those locations. And I really think that that's why legislation was passed earlier to grant women's suffrage in those locations, and why it was a harder sell in, like, for example, in Northeastern area where people are still influenced by Victorian ideology, especially the middle and upper classes who are setting the trends. And they're sending the message that the women's place is in the household and the men's place is in the public, and that's going to die hard, that ideology.
So that pioneering kind of spirit and the
Yeah.
necessity of people having to work together and so on. Yeah. Okay. And question now about different countries. I mean, certainly all countries in the world did not have rights for women to vote. Can you speak about the U.S. in comparison with other countries? You know, which ones were ahead of us, which ones coming behind, and you know, if you have any reasons that you would offer for that.
So I feel like the U.S. was sort of a middle ground in terms of granting women the right to vote. We definitely weren't one of the earliest countries to do it, but we weren't one of the latest either. There's still a lot of areas in the world where women are harshly discriminated against today and don't have equal political rights. But England granted women the right to vote. The first suffrage law, I believe, for women was 1918, and then it was amended to, I think, increase the age not long after. And so we passed our suffrage law in 1920. So, you know, I used to know more about like the international context, but, you know, I off the top of my head, I would have to review more literature on it. I'm not coming, you know, I can't think of a lot of dates or specific countries off the top of my head at the moment, but I don't think we were like, we definitely weren't one of the first, like we weren't pioneering and doing it, but we definitely, you know, are not, we have these rights now that a lot of places, you know, women don't have in a lot of other countries even today.
Okay, we have another question just coming in now about the recognition of Black women's participation. You alluded to that, but could you summarize the eventual recognition that Black women voters received by the general suffrage movement? Did that come afterwards? I mean, after they got the 19th Amendment passed, did they then decide to recognize the needs of the Black voters?
Because of poll taxes and literacy tests in a lot of locations in the South, African Americans continue to face a lot of harsh discrimination that prevented them from casting a ballot. And, you know, I think there's a misconception that racism was only a Southern problem. It was not, right? It was something that occurred throughout the country. And I think there was a cultural discrimination and racism that existed even in the North that prevented a lot of African Americans from receiving equal treatment, even if it wasn't politically, there weren't politically laws against them maybe casting a ballot. They faced a social and cultural sort of discrimination in other areas as well. But we know that a lot of African Americans women were active in the League of Women Voters in different areas. I know that the LWV did have some segregated branches at times, and then over time they did become more integrated. It just depended on the location, what the branch looked like in terms of the diversity of the members. There were, I'm trying to think, I was just reviewing an exhibit for Wilton Historical Society, and they found a very interesting source that said essentially that at a suffrage event there was actually like a blackface performance, and I thought that was like pretty shocking because obviously during the time period that's going to be like a pretty accepted and popular form of entertainment, but we know it's inherently racist. So I think the exhibit said, like, who authorized this? Was it the white suffragists that, you know, organized the event, or did this person just sort of show up and they were involved in, you know, the activities? Was it even questioned that it could be prejudice during the time period? Probably not. And so I just thought that was really interesting because it's just, you know, it's an example of, I guess, the racism that existed in the movement, you know, and that might not even been something that people really thought about in the moment, but now we can reflect on it and look at how that could be discriminatory, having this figure there. You know, we're looking at it in a different lens in 2021, but it could be evidence of like the mindset, the white supremacy and stuff like that, even in, you know, Connecticut, for example, at that suffrage fair in Wilton.
Yeah. Okay, and I know you alluded to this in your presentation, but we do have a request for you to just summarize the recognition of Black women and their participation in the suffrage movement.
Yeah, so African American women, the CWSA obviously sent activists into African American churches to rally support for women's right to vote. There were a lot of African American women in New Haven who were active in the movement. We know that African American women who are members of the National Association for Colored Women's Clubs supported a lot of times women's suffrage because that was a major issue that organization endorsed. We know the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People also put suffrage as an issue on their plank. And so if you are a member of the NAACP, you likely would have endorsed their cause. Like we said, the Connecticut Historical Society has an online exhibit, and I gave like 6 or 7 different examples of African-American activists from the state earlier who were campaigners for women's right to vote. or who are, we believe, campaigners possibly for women's right to vote based on the research of Brittany Yancey and others of the Connecticut in the project for the Connecticut Historical Society on their website. And that's an ongoing project. So they're still trying to uncover more about these women's biographical information and also details about their activism for that. I know that website online.
Okay, and after the 19th Amendment was passed, did any of the suffragettes get involved in voting rights for Black Americans, you know, Native Americans, Asian Americans, any of these other people who were left out of the mainstream?
Yeah, absolutely. There were, I think it's a misconception that all the whites, I think there's a tendency, I think we've gone, you know, to kind of blanket like, oh, all the white suffragists were racist. That's not true. A lot of them were very progressively minded. In Connecticut, Josephine Bennett was an ally of, you know, working with African Americans in general to improve civil rights and things like that. There were a number, Inez Holland and her father were really involved in supporting civil rights when they were alive. And so there were a number of activists. I mean, there's some examples of racists, there are some, but there were activists too who are examples of people who are a little bit more progressively minded and certainly would consider the rights of other minority groups and wanted to cross the racial line in the campaign as well. There's a New York State suffrage organization that was trying to work with women in Harlem during the time period and help mobilize them and get them involved in the state campaign and kind of link up groups, you know, African-American groups and white groups. So it wasn't like, you know, just that all these women were discriminatory or anything like that.
Okay, and again, after the amendment passed, we said there were other issues for different demographic groups, but did many of the suffragettes continue to be involved in issues that just getting people to be able to register, trying to get them involved, trying to get them educated about how to vote or anything like that? Or was there a feeling, you know, that the amendment was passed, we did it, let's, you know, leave it at that?
The League of Women Voters worked tirelessly after 1920, as did city civic groups and a variety of other organizations to support citizenship education and voter training and literacy, well into the 20th century. And they continue to do that even today, and to support the objective of encouraging people to cast a ballot and also informing them about basic political platforms and just, you know, what they need to do to get more actively involved.
Okay, well, we have time for only one more question, so I'll ask you this one. You work at a university, so obviously you're around people, you know, late teens, early 20s, and so on. How do the college students generally view things like the suffrage movement? They just see that as something that happened so long ago, they don't want to address it, or are they very interested in it? What sort of reaction do you get from students typically?
Well, I think I'm really privileged because I work at a school that's known for having students that are very engaged in the community and socially aware. So I find that my students are very interested in hearing about social and political causes and issues that are going on. And, you know, throughout the whole election, there was a lot of buzz around campus trying to get, you know, people registered to vote and voting. Up until that election, we have I'm fortunate because we have a very engaged student body at Sacred Heart. And so I've seen a lot of interest in this topic. We had several events on campus about, you know, suffrage and political issues and things like that in the fall semester.
Yeah, and when you speak to your colleagues at other universities, do they have similar reactions, or do you think that maybe Sacred Heart, as you say, is a little different from most, but you know, what kind of range are we talking about here?
Well, I think especially this election in November got a lot of attention. I think I was in Fairfield, and I look relatively young. I'm a lot older than I look. And I was in downtown Fairfield on the street, and a very young looking person, probably in high school or college, came up to me on the street and asked me if I was registered to vote. And so I really do think that it's been unprecedented, the interest in sort of some of these issues in politics and things that are going on. I think people are watching, and I think younger generations are a lot more engaged than in the past, for sure. I mean, that's just my opinion, but I tend to be like an optimist. So like, I don't know.
Okay. Well, that's a good point with that. Okay, we're about out of time. So thank you so much. We really enjoyed your presentation and your insights. It was very helpful. And I hope the other wise women out there, hello, I hope you enjoy being part of this as well. And I hope the other wise women will join us every second and fourth Monday. We have a presentation coming up. Our next one will be Dr. Prum talking about the evolution of beauty. We have 2 people in February. one Jane Ferrara from Mercy Learning Center, and then we have Bill Harris from the Community Theater in downtown Fairfield. So we hope all of you can join us then. And thank you again, Kelly. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.